Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Cup Chat. We are 7.3 seconds, 7 minutes and 3 seconds late because we were having technical difficulties. Thankfully, we have technology that can bring us all together, but sometimes it doesn't always want to cooperate. So today on Cup Chat, we are talking all about hawks. And joining me today is Dr. Maureen Frank, our wildlife extension specialist here at Texas A&M, and Bryan Calk, our favorite and the original Birding with Extension guide, who guides for Learn to Bird, as well as our feature program, Birding the Border, and is going to be our guide on our new advanced youth camp, Rio Diablo Birding Camp based here out of Del Rio. We will be traveling all over West Texas later, end of May in 2021. So if you're interested in any of our other programs, make sure you go to our website and check those out. But today we're talking all about hawks. And, Maureen, why today? Why did y'all decide to pick hawks today? Let's talk.
Well,
it's 7:30 in the morning. We could talk about a lot of other good stuff.
And that's funny. That's kind of an interesting point as far as we normally hold these early in the morning for a couple of reasons. But one is that birders tend to get up early because that's the best time to see birds. But when we're talking about hawks, that's not actually really true. That you can definitely see them early in the morning, but hawk migration depends a lot on how they're going to be, moving around. And in some places, you kind of have to wait for it to get warmer for them to like really see them soaring on those thermals. And not that you can't see them in the morning, but I feel like it's not as critical to get out early as it is for some of our other songbirds. So maybe, sorry, Em, we should have, held like a 12:30 in the afternoon.
I would have appreciated that because we all know that I'm not a morning person.
But the bottom line for why to talk about hawks this time of year is that it's fall migration. And with a lot of our bird species, I think we've talked about this on here before, fall migration is not overall as spectacular as spring migration, mostly because obviously you have the same, the same birds.
Boys and foods and girls.
Moving, right. But it's not happening all at once. Like in spring, it's kind of, you take all those species moving around and you compress it into the short period of time. And in fall, we have some species that have been migrating since late July or early August. So there's some species that have been migrating since like what we would still consider the summer. And then some species still aren't going to migrate until December. So it's this big, long time period over which we spread migration. But for hawks, they're such a big, charismatic species that are easy to see, and they take advantage of things like fronts that they can kind of ride down, which a lot of bird species do that as well. But their hawk migration is just a little more, I feel like a little more spectacular than some of our other birds that we get to see, because you can really see large numbers of them going all at once, which is pretty cool.
So you talk about fall migration being this long period of time, and of course that can span even with hawks over a long period of time. But when should we be looking in South Texas, Bryan? When are we needing to get our binoculars out and really start watching for our hawks as they migrate south through Texas?
Sure. So in your region, Southwest Texas, we generally start seeing birds moving in September, all the way through about November. And then by then we're mostly set up with winter resident species. But further east, where you have species like swallow-tailed kites and Mississippi kites, they migrate as early as August. So really we're already in the thick of it.
Well, and that's super true. I thought I get lots of miles on the road, as Bryan and Maureen know, but I was driving yesterday and I'm actually getting on the road again today and then on the road again tomorrow. And just driving, I was noticing how many more hawks I got to see. So you are so right that we are in the thick of it. In Texas, you can see over 20 species of hawks through migration, some that live here, some that don't. Maureen, what are some identification tips that we need to be utilizing as we are watching out for those hawks?
Yeah, so hawks are a good thing to practice some of the, when we had some of the guides on talking about like tips for beginners, hawks are a good thing to practice using some of those less, like the things that don't jump into your mind right away, like size and shape. because a lot of times you see a colorful, songbird and you're like, oh, I noticed the colors on it, right? But we talked about how it's really important to pay attention to the size and the shape of that bird as well. Well, with hawks, a lot of times they're going to be soaring like way far away. And so you can't see what color they are sometimes, or if the light is hitting them a certain way. Lots of them have distinctive patterns like on the underside of their wings, but you're just probably not going to rely on that as much as you would for a bird that you're looking at like at a feeder or in your yard a little more up close. And so it's really important to look at things like size and shape. And some of the things that are important to focus on are the shape of the wings. So some of them are going to be more rounded, some of them are going to be pointier. The shape and the size of the head and the tail relative to the rest of the body. So in some birds, you're just going to kind of compare, how long are the wings compared to the body, or how long is the tail compared to the length of the body. So it's really a lot more about those size and shape characteristics than it is about, color or patterns. But you can see those as well. Then there's certain species that you will key in, like harriers. Northern harriers are one that we often see this time of year kind of skimming over agricultural fields, and they have a nice white patch on their rump that makes them pretty easy to identify, along with the fact that behavior comes in as well. Because we think about hawks soaring up high, harriers often cruise really low over the fields. And so that's kind of another distinguishing characteristic for them.
So let's talk really quick about some common species. If there were 5 hawk species here in Southwest Texas that birders probably needed to know, what are some of those top 3 or top 5 hawk species that we need that birders should get familiar with, those things that we talked about, like size, shape, and some of the difference of behavioral aspects? Sorry, off the cuff question, guys.
Sure. So in specific to Southwest Texas, one I would say for sure is the Harris's hawk. Year-round resident, very distinctive, and pretty common in the brush country. Red-tailed hawk, more of a winter resident, more of a sparse more sparse in the summer. I would say American kestrel is a small falcon, really common across the whole region. Again, winter resident. I would say Cooper's hawk would be another great one, really common in urban and suburban areas, anywhere you have trees. What else do you think, Maureen?
I think, let's see, I know I mentioned harrier, and yeah, Cooper's and Sharpshin, and red-tailed hawks are one that are like kind of classic that a lot of people think of. I think those, as far as just like covering a broad swath of Texas, I've definitely seen a lot of kestrels lately. I think that's most of them.
Yep.
So if you are starting to work on your hawk identification, make sure you are starting on that. And now let's talk about the different groups of our hawks or falcons, all of that together. So can you talk about that a little bit, guys, for everybody?
Sure. So one of the great ways to start with identifying raptors is to really know the groups that we can categorize them in. So we've already mentioned falcons. We have our Sharpshin Cooper's hawk that we would call accipiters, our larger, more classic looking hawks that we would call buteos. And then there's eagles. Northern harrier kind of is on his own, but each of these have really unique characteristics that sort of all the hawks or all the raptors under that category sort of have very similar, shape of the wings or habitat preference or whatever. But if you can kind of narrow it down to one of those things, you're already on a great track for identification.
Awesome. And so let's break it down and let's talk about some very specific examples. You want to talk, y'all both mentioned the Northern Harrier. Y'all want to kind of dive into that species and give some examples about some specific ID things?
Sure. I'm going to try to share my screen real quick and we'll look at some pictures, hopefully. Just let me know if it's working for you.
It says you're started, it's loading. Yep, you can see it.
Okay. Let me try to start this real quick. Okay, so just to go over what I was just talking about, kind of categorizing things into different groups by shape. Um, you can see all these different silhouettes, and all of them have sort of unique features or proportions that we can use to identify them and sort of categorize them. So at the top left, we have buteos with big broad wings and larger heads, eagles with long straight wings and smaller heads, a harrier, like Maureen was describing, with long wings and a long tail, accipiters, again, Maureen nailed it, with short rounded wings and a long tail and a smaller head, falcons with sort of pointed wings with longer tail, osprey, which is kind of its own thing, but it holds its wings in this very distinct M shape. And then here we have a turkey vulture with really
Question
broad
your
wings.
M's.
What's that?
Your vision of that being an M, it doesn't look like an M to me.
Oh,
I'd have to think of my own trick there.
yeah. To me, it looks like an M, just from the wings here to the body.
Ooh, you know what it almost looks like? It almost looks like the Yellowstone Y, except for with no bottom.
The Yellowstone Y?
Yeah, like the TV show.
Oh, whatever works for you. See, this is one thing we want to reiterate. When you're learning to bird, don't rely too heavily on whatever the books tell you. Use whatever works for you. And so the harrier, so using all those things we were talking about, sort of the shape, and kind of building a case for each species. So, you know, if you were just going to say, oh, I see a hawk with a white rump, you know, there's other hawks that have white rumps, like Harris's hawk. And from some angles, you could see maybe one of the accipiters looks like it has a white rump. So you don't want to lean on any one of these things to nail down an ID. You want to build a case for each species. So with it having its white rump, and you see it, you know, flying low over grassy fields, looking down into the grass, listening for prey below it, and you see it in the winter if you're in South Texas, all these things can add up to it being a northern harrier. And so we see, you don't want to say, oh, if it's a gray hawk, it's a northern harrier. Well, females are all brown and streaky all over, looking completely different. Here's a nice juvenile male here. So lots of diversity in plumage, but behaviorally, structurally, they're all the same. And cool thing about harriers, they have these facial discs like an owl that they use to listen for prey below them. Really unique.
That's a really good point. Can you go back real quick, Brian, just to add to something that I said earlier, as far as I said, I kind of key in on the white rump when I see it, and I know that's a northern harrier. That is a good point to say that, like, I also see it in combination with it flying low. Like, there's that behavior that I key on because we have lots of Harris's hawks as well. So for one, I'm very used to how the Harris's hawks fly because we have them year round. And so when it's winter, I can tell that the northern harriers are something different by the way they're behaving, and by the rest of their patterns. So that's a good point too, because I have, I've heard people say, well, oh, it was holding its wings a certain way, so I know that it was, an osprey. But if that's the only reason that you think it was an osprey, it might not be, because I have seen other hawks hold their wings. I mean, even that top picture that you have on the left, where it's kind of got its wings pulled up a little bit,
Exactly.
you can see hawks hold their wings a lot of different ways. So that's a good point that you made about building the case and making sure you have multiple reasons why you say that it's a particular species.
Right, absolutely. Yep. Let's see. And then if we have time, I was going to go over a couple more.
I'm good. I'm enjoying. I've got a little more coffee, so keep going.
Okay. So another group that we talked about were the accipiters. And in South Texas, we have two species we can expect, the sharp-shinned hawk and the Cooper's hawk. And both of them have a lot of similarities. Accipiters have, like we said, short rounded wings, smaller heads, longer tails. But you also want to, again, build a case for why it is what it is. Habitat is a great tool to use. Sharpshin and Cooper's hawks both pursue prey on the wing, typically preferring small birds. So they're often in areas with trees or forested areas. Let's see. And then the Sharpshin hawk, we have this sort of extremely small head, really petite overall, even more broad rounded wings, really snappy wing beats. And one thing a lot of people use or say to use in identifying or separating the two species is the shape of the tail. Say Sharpshins typically have a squared tail in flight, whereas Coopers have more of a rounded tail. But again, like we were saying, sort of building a case, this is not something you want to rely on, because when the tail is in molt, this square tail can appear rounded, or the rounded tail on a Cooper's hawk can appear more square. So things are not always, exactly what the textbook tells you they are. Versus a Cooper's hawk, which looks almost identical in plumage with adults and juveniles, but just bulkier overall. You see that larger head, relatively longer wings, and here in all of these you can see more rounded tail, just proportionally larger. And a great tool that we haven't mentioned yet, or haven't mentioned by name yet, is sort of the seasonality of when the hawks are in your area. So Cooper's hawks are a year-round resident in South Texas, whereas Sharpshin hawks breed further north and at higher elevations and only spend the winter in South Texas. So if you see one of these guys in July, that's a really great, reason to think that you're looking at a Cooper's hawk and not a Sharpshin hawk.
Bryan, can I say one more kind of fun ID tip that you just made me think of for just like general accipiters versus Budios?
Sure.
So one of the things that we talk about,
yes. Zero
what?
fun. I said, no, you can't give any fun tips. I'd be completely out of line here.
One of the things that we talk about with youth during bobwhite brigades, or that we'll do with adults like during quail appreciation days, is kind of the way these birds fly. So Bryan mentioned that Coopers and Sharpshin hawks, their main prey are small birds. They also are really accipiter hawks are one of the #1 predators of bobwhite quail. And so when we're talking to our landowners about quail management, this is part of why we focus so much on why it's important to have shelter for our quail, is because these are, obviously a protected species. They're not a predator that we're going to try to, manage for, but it's, having that way for quail to escape is going to be really important. And when we talk about the difference between hawks, or if we're playing the game Run for Your Life, we talk about Budio hawks being, Dr. Dale Rollins calls them basically like the B-52s of the hawk world, because they fly a lot slower. There's a lot more of that soaring. And so they're like these big, slow moving birds compared to our accipiters, like our Sharpshin and our Coopers, which are like fighter jets, because they are quick and they are small and they are agile and they're able to do things like take a bird on the wing. So of course, when we're talking about quail, they're usually on the ground. And so Budios can take them. But when we're talking about doing something like catching a songbird in, mid-flight, our accipiters are really a lot more built for that.
It was
so if you like your planes, that might be a helpful tip.
It was fun. I'll let it slide this time.
Thanks.
All right.
I think I'm finished.
Okay. I didn't know if you had more.
Yeah, no, I think we've, pretty well gone over, how to use these tools for identification with different hawks. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think something Bryan mentioned, maybe it was a couple weeks ago now, about when we were just talking about learning to identify birds, and if you're keeping a list, like marking them on eBird especially, that it's so important to be accurate. And so if you are sure that something was was a particular species, you've built up that whole case, then absolutely you mark that down. But a lot of times people feel like maybe they failed if they can't get it to an exact species. But especially with hawks, I mean, even if you can get to Buteo versus accipiter, I do this all the time. I'm like, I saw Buteo. I don't know which one it was. It may have been too far away, or it was too brief of a glance to identify anything else on it. But even if you just get down to Buteo versus accipiter versus, knowing it was a falcon, knowing it was an eagle, that's really important. And so just kind of a reminder when you're keeping whether it's a written list or especially through on eBird, because those data are being used by scientists, it's okay if you can't get it all the way down to an exact species. And even just practicing getting birds into those groups is really important, and that still contributes information. So.
Sorry. Well, great all about hawks chat today, or I guess all raptors. We kind of jumped around and talked about a few others. But I think that one thing that I really enjoy y'all talk about today, and I think the take-home message has to be, whether you're looking at hawks or if you are looking at songbirds, is making a case for your identification and not relying on one thing. And I think that that's one thing that sometimes is maybe it's a hard principle, but something it's also a learning experience, is to learn those other characteristics, those other the behaviors, the habitat, the migration patterns, their range. If you can put all of that together, think about how much more you're learning about that bird versus just knowing that that's a green jay, or knowing, I always think back to my time at the Rio Grande Valley wherever I went, I can't even tell y'all know the name of where I went because y'all picked it out, but just saw hundreds and hundreds of green jay and hundreds and hundreds of chocolaca, I felt like. And that was really cool, but they all just came to the food. But in the normal circumstances, there are not going to be 100 chocolaca, and there are not going to be 100 green jay just coming in and blaring in my face. And so being able to understand their behaviors, understand where they're supposed to be living, understand their coloration patterns, their moltings, and all of that just goes into making you a better birder and taking that birding to the next level. And so with all of our extension programs, whether it's Cup Chat, Learn to Bird, Birding the Border, or Rio Diablo Bird Camp, that is our goal, is we want you to have an experience, and we want you to learn and grow as a birder. So we want you to see great birds, don't get us wrong, and we want to check all of our checklists off, but we do want to make sure that it is a growth experience for everybody. So thank you both for joining us for Cup Chat this week, talking about hawks. I think next week we have a new guest. I cannot reveal their name or their gender. We're super excited to have them because we think that there could be somebody watching today that might give that away. And we want to keep it a surprise. And so we're super excited to have them on next week. And you'll need to tune in to see who it is.
Yeah, and I think I gave a hint without even meaning to as to what we'll be talking about, but we'll talk about something super fun. So
you did, yes, you did. So we will announce Cup Chat later in the week as to what our topic is going to be. We are not going to announce our special guest, but we are thankful, Bryan, you could join us. Have a safe trip. It is daylight there, so you can now start birding. And we will see everyone soon. And thanks for tuning in. Bye, guys.